Beautiful Mississippi Gulf Coast. Starting a little late tonight, but we are always happy to be back at the Balcony Sports Lounge on the second floor of restaurant 200 North Beach. Got a beautiful view as always. Got a great crowd out tonight, and we got a lot to talk about. Big weekend in sports, in football, in New Orleans and South Louisiana, all over the Gulf Coast. I'm sure everybody was tuned in because Louisiana was the epicenter of football in America over this past weekend. We're going to break down all the big games, and we'll spin it ahead a little bit to this weekend's action. I'm your host, Jeff Duncan, joined as always, well, not always, but joined quite regularly by my colleague, cohort in crime, our Saints beat writer at the Times-Picayune and NOLA.com, Josh Katzenstein. Welcome, Josh.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be here, as always, although I don't like the whole daylight savings time because I feel like we go on and on about the view here, and now it's dark, so it's not quite as nice.
Yeah, we need to take care of that. Can we light up the bay out there somehow, get that lit up? We'll talk to Jim about that.
I think Jim could probably
Jim
do
probably could
that.
take care of that over here. He runs Bay St. Louis for the most part. Look, we're excited about being here as always, and we want to give you a little bit of the protocol as always. We want questions from our audience here or on Facebook. Anybody watching the live stream right now, you want to submit a question, Jennifer will take care of that. Anyone else here that wants to submit a question, please put your name on there so we can acknowledge who the question's from, and we'll try to give you our best answer without lying. We like to be above board.
I appreciate that we have one gentleman who's eager. He can't wait to get his question out.
Yes. So,
thankfully, it's probably not about Ole Miss.
Well, while we wait on that and while we get to the questions, let's talk about yesterday's game because that's freshest in our mind. We were at the Superdome yesterday at this time, as a matter of fact, covering the Saints' big victory, 45-35 against the Los Angeles Rams. It was the game of the year so far, probably in the NFL. And the Saints, well, first of all, it lived up to its billing. We thought it would be a high-scoring shootout, and there would be a lot of action, a lot of touchdowns, and it's exactly what we got. Over 900 yards total offense, 10 touchdowns, only 3 punts. And we just saw some spectacular offensive playmaking by both sides. And I think the Saints really kept alive their hopes by winning yesterday. I don't think they've wrapped up anything, and I think they would acknowledge that. But if they'd have lost, they'd have had a very difficult time, I think, trying to get to where they want to go, which is the number 1 seed in the NFC playoffs. By winning, I think now they pull basically within a half game of the Rams in the overall standings in the NFC, and I think gives themselves a great shot of getting at least one of the first 2 seeds in the NFC.
Yeah, absolutely, and you're right. I mean, a lot of players, noted that it's only the midway point and that, they haven't accomplished anything yet. Sheldon Rankins and Drew Brees both said that they expect the Rams certainly to keep on winning, and I'm sure that's going to be the case. I mean, they came in here 8-0, now they're only 8-1, but I can't imagine. I think they play the Seahawks at home this week, so I imagine they'll get back on the winning track. But, right now I think it'd be easy to say that the Saints are the best team in the NFC because they beat who you would argue, are the other contenders for that, the Rams, number 1, and then I would say probably still the Vikings, number 2. Yes. And then the Eagles have not looked as good, but the Saints will have their opportunity
Panthers
against them in 2 weeks. The Panthers look good. I'm still surprised. I had some friends who were saying that they really expected the Panthers to be good this year, but with their offensive line, I was not thinking that would be the case. I think Matt Khalil is a terrible left tackle, and that's the guy they were relying on, and then he gets hurt, and so whoever their backup was, I just assumed that he would be the one thing that I think people take issue with the schedule is that the Saints won't be seeing them until, 2 out of the last 3 games of the year. So, yeah, that'll be tough. But certainly right now with how the offense has looked and with the opportunistic defense, which I know is a big buzzword that people like to use, but it certainly proved true yesterday against the Rams. I think the Saints certainly look like a legitimate Super Bowl contender, and I really don't know who's going to beat them.
Yeah, I think the reason we're already speculating that far down the road is I think both these teams look pretty legitimate.
Yeah.
So I think we all expect them to be in the hunt. Maybe some other contenders work their way into that picture, but I think the Saints and the Rams are legit, and I think they're going to be there, and so it makes a lot of sense to project that far down the road. Now, before the Saints game on Sunday, a little bit of a letdown, I guess, to put it mildly, down in Baton Rouge. Tiger Stadium was the site of another Alabama LSU showdown in the SEC West, and it wasn't once they kicked off, it wasn't much of a competition. The Alabama Crimson Tide, we all knew they were the best team in the country, and they validated it on Saturday, 29-0. The largest margin of victory, I think, since early 2000s. I think it might have been 2002. They won 31-0 against, oddly enough, a Nick Saban coached LSU team. But I don't think anybody expected that kind of beatdown. At least I didn't. I thought Alabama would win. I didn't think they would win that convincingly. Did you get to catch any of the game? What were your thoughts of it once you saw the outcome?
Yeah, I watched it. I was at Tracy's, and you could feel the energy zapped out of there pretty quickly. I mean, the first takeaway is that Tua is amazing. Like, I don't know. I mean, Alabama has had such a hard time finding legitimate quarterbacks. I mean, you could say that, a couple guys, Greg McElroy, A.J. McCarron, had a couple solid seasons by college standards, but nobody expected them to be good in the NFL. I think Tua could go to the NFL today and probably be better than any of these rookie quarterbacks that came out in this draft class. I mean, he's incredible. I thought the best chance the Saints had, that LSU had to win was, when it seemed like he might have gotten hurt earlier in the game. And obviously he just got kicked where you don't want to get kicked. But, yeah, I mean, LSU really had no answer for that offense. I thought Joe Burrow got exposed in the worst way, and I wasn't really surprised by that. I think it was a lot of smoke and mirrors with him. He had the issues with completion percentage early in the year. He was being inaccurate. And, the one saving grace for him was that he might be more athletic than people thought. But I think, if this guy was really what people expected, he probably would have stayed at Ohio State and had that job there.
Well, in his defense, and I'll defend him a little bit because that is a common narrative coming out of that game. I mean, they were playing Alabama, one of the best defenses in the country, and his offensive line didn't do him any favors. They were kind of getting exposed themselves up front. And he was having to make plays on the run a lot, having to come from behind because they got down. But he is what he is. It's a overused sports phrase, but I think he's a good, solid SEC quarterback. I don't think he's a special player like Tua Tagovailoa, who, in my opinion, is one of the best college quarterbacks we've seen in the last decade. I think he's going to be a dynamite NFL player. And he reminds me, and I mentioned this at the game, he reminds me a little of Russell Wilson and Drew Brees, kind of. He's very accurate. He gets the ball out very quick. He's decisive. He can run. He really has everything but the size. He's probably 6 foot, 6'1". But as far as the confidence and leading a team, and here's what I'll say, Josh, and we can get into a little more of this game a little bit later, but I don't know if Alabama is ever going to lose while Tua is the quarterback. I mean, he's going to come back next year. They're going to be loaded. He may be the only college football player to ever play his entire career and never lose a game.
And, I mean, if he does that, he'll have 3 national championships?
Yes. Arguably the greatest college career in the history of college football. And I think he's going to do it because I don't see anybody beating this Alabama team in the next 2 or 3 years unless something happens to him.
Yeah, that wouldn't surprise me. I mean, there were a couple of plays, I mean, that the Crimson Tide left out there. I mean, that he made and the receivers, either dropped or made a bad step. And, I mean, I think everyone at LSU was, going crazy when he threw that interception, but that was effectively like a punt. I mean, LSU didn't do anything with that ball after they got it. And I mean, that's really, what it is. It's like his one mistake is like, everyone's in awe because they expect him to basically play a perfect game because up until that point he really had. But then after the pick, I mean, he was incredible. That run was dynamite. I mean, one of the best plays I've seen in college football this season, certainly. But I do want to go back to Joe Burrow just real quick because I don't want people to think that I'm just, jumping on the narrative that everyone
Alabama.
Is.
Alabama. A lot of teams lose to Alabama.
Here was my issue. It was awareness that was a problem because I'm not going to say that the moment was too big for him because we saw he played well against Georgia in that win, but there was just some times where he scrambled and he would always run up the middle, which is like the opposite of what you want to do against Alabama because I think it's pretty well known that they don't always get a lot of sacks because their defensive line is just playing a lot more containment. And it's like he just ran up there without having any idea that those guys were standing there and that they could quickly jump off a block and take him down. So, I mean, it seemed like, both lack of preparation on his part, lack of preparation on the coach's part, and LSU, not just Burrow, really got exposed, as to having more weaknesses than we thought.
Well, Ed Ogeron did say that Steve Ensminger, the offensive coordinator, was frustrated with Joe Burrow. So there's some validity, I think, to what you're saying. I don't think he played his best game by any means, but it was against the best team in the country by far. We do have a question on this game from Booga T, who wants to know why did Ed Ogeron concede defeat by electing for the field goal late. He thought he would be more aggressive. I did too. He was asked about it after the game, and he said that he just wanted to get some points on the board, give his team a little confidence. Did not seem like the right move at the time to me, because at the time they were 3 scores. They could have 3 touchdowns. I know that's crazy to think, but that's the coaching manual play. Go for the touchdown there. Don't kick the field goal. And, of course, Cole Tracy misses the field goal. So the gridiron gods kind of did not shine on Ed Ogeron. I didn't like that call either, but I also understood a little bit. I don't think it mattered one way or the other. They were not going to beat Alabama on that night. They probably just did not want to get shut out. They've been shut out by Alabama the last now 2 times they played in Tiger Stadium. They haven't scored at Tiger Stadium against Alabama since 2014. They haven't scored a touchdown since the first quarter of 2014. So thorough domination by Alabama in this series.
Some guy at the bar, an Alabama fan, just started yelling, "Best kicker in the country, best kicker in the country," because, that was like one of the big things that LSU was going to have the big advantage in the kicking game. But, yeah, I don't like that. That is the coaching manual to kick the field goal. They seem to think that getting some points on the board, gives your team confidence that they can do it again. But it's just stupid. We're here to win a game. I think everyone should be trying to win the game, not just to – there's no moral victories in football or any sports, once you're at this level. So I didn't think that made any sense.
Yeah, it didn't. And I can tell you, just let me backtrack a little bit, talk a little bit about the game because, I've covered a lot of games in my career. That's saying I'm old. I know you're going to say that next. But
you are.
About 20 years at the Times-Picayune. Before that, I worked in Tennessee, so I covered SEC games at Vanderbilt and Tennessee. If Vanderbilt qualifies, I'm not sure they qualify for full SEC status.
Their football team is typically just as good as Kentucky. So
Right. But I've covered a lot of games. I've never seen anything like the atmosphere at the LSU-Alabama game. Pre-game, I was with some colleagues from the Washington Post, from the Los Angeles Times. They were blown away. They'd never seen anything like it as well. We went out in the tailgate fields. It was the easiest game I've ever driven to at LSU. You'd think it would have been the hardest game because there was reportedly 100,000 fans that didn't even have tickets to the game that were out just tailgating, wanting to be a part of the scene. But I think everybody was already there. We left at 2 o'clock out of New Orleans. Game started at 7. We gave ourselves plenty of time, and we got there in an hour and 20 minutes. No traffic, because I think everybody was already on campus tailgating and being a part of festivities. And the Tiger Walk, I'm sure you're all familiar with that, before the game, where the team comes off the bus up at the Indian Mounds. They walk down Victory Lane. That was electric. Fans were thousands of fans lined up. Ed Ogeron, I thought he looked like a MMA fighter going into the ring, into the octagon. Apparently he used to do that at Ole Miss. Famously ripped his shirt off once in a team meeting. That was part of a book about Ed Ogeron's time at Ole Miss. That was the Ole Miss Ed Ogeron walking down Tiger Walk. He was, bumping his chest. He was thrusting his fist like Tiger Woods, did when he makes a big putt. Ran over to the crowd, was like hugging fans, screaming. You could see the spittle coming out of his mouth. They were fired up, and then the reality set in once they got on the field with Alabama. That was the highlight of LSU's day, was the Tiger Walk, because after that it was all Alabama. Okay, I got another question about the quarterback situation from Booga T, who is by far our most popular question asker today.
Shout out to Booga.
Wants to know, after a decade accepting Mettenberger, with the exception of the Mettenberger year, how or when will LSU get a quarterback that's not miserable or mediocre? And that's a great question. And I actually think one of the things that LSU has to do to upgrade the quarterback position is I think they've got to get a great quarterback coach. And I know next year they're talking about hiring Sean Salisbury, former NFL quarterback. He actually was going to be hired this year. There was an NCAA technicality. He couldn't get hired. They're going to bring him in. I think they need to get somebody like that on the staff that's going to attract top prospects to want to come here because they all are looking at the NFL at that level. They want to see somebody on the staff that can show them how to play at the NFL level. Sean Salisbury, I think, can do that. He has a lot of connections to Louisiana. He knows Ed Ogeron from Southern Cal days. And I think that'll happen. That's one of the things they'll think will help them because right now you're looking at LSU staff and there's no one there that's going to attract you to come there to play quarterback at an elite level the way Alabama's staff is right now with tons of former NFL assistants on the staff. So I think Ed Ogeron understands he needs to upgrade that, but it's going to take another year because of that. And, yeah, go ahead.
I mean, as always, I got to be the contrarian devil's advocate because Jeff is normally wrong, as we all know. These kids don't care about Sean Salisbury.
Who invited him? I'm sorry?
These kids don't know anything about Sean Salisbury. I know Sean Salisbury because he used to be on ESPN all the time and, doing those wacky picks or whatever.
It's not about knowing him. I mean, once they sit down with him and they see he knows what he's talking about and he played in the NFL, I mean, that's definitely
He started 12 games in the NFL.
So he played in the NFL.
I just don't know that he's going to be.
Was it like how long you played? Is that how good you are?
Oh, but I mean, I'm telling you, like kids these days want someone recognizable or at least someone that has done something impressive.
It's better than what they've got.
Okay, that may be the case.
If you want to bring in like just some guy that can't coach.
But what coaching experience does he have? He might have some. I'm not familiar.
I just think it's a move in the right direction. Getting a quarterback specialist. He's worked at all these camps.
Okay.
Like he's like a Trent Dilfer type. All right. Well, we'll talk about the Saints. We'll get to it. The LSU game was big.
It was. Well, actually, I mean, I saw some questions on Facebook real quick.
We do.
Someone.
Go ahead.
Someone asked about Trey Hendrickson, who was filling in with Marcus Davenport out with a toe injury. He had one tackle and one quarterback hit. He played 29 snaps, which was a pretty, significant role, especially because he hadn't been active since week one.
I thought he played well.
But he flashed a few times certainly, and this is a guy who, in training camp, he looked like their second best defensive end. Throughout all of training camp, I think to a man, at least in the media, we would have said that, but that was partly due to the fact that Alex Okafor was, still coming back from injury. Marcus Davenport was out for like a month. So then, once the season got rolling, Hendrickson sort of became, the in case of emergency option, and that's why he was inactive for the past 6 games. But I certainly think that they will be able to handle things defensively with him in there as long as Davenport's out.
Well, we do have another question that I'll get to here. I'm not sure. There's no name on this question, so I'm a little leery of reading it off. But he asks, Jeff, do you have any mirrors in your house? Your post-game podcast from the stadium last night showed I had on a plaid shirt and a plaid blazer. What's wrong with that? That's called fashion. That's called style.
No.
I'm on the cutting edge, my friend.
You can't go competing plaids, Jeff.
You
can't go polka dots and stripes. Like, these are just some basic rules.
I'm on the cutting edge. Everybody loved my outfit. I don't even know what you're all talking about, but I'm glad to know that somebody was watching our post-game pod.
I heard 0 people compliment your outfit.
Yeah, well, it's because you weren't there.
I got at least one compliment on my shirt, so.
Right. Well, there'll be more of that. Keep watching the podcast or keep watching the post-game videos because I've got lots of surprises fashion-wise. From Jennifer Kelly on Facebook, how do you feel about the play of the secondary, especially Eli Apple? I think that's a really good question. I thought Eli Apple looked a lot more comfortable yesterday. That's to be expected. It was only like his second game. I think they've clearly upgraded at that corner spot. I don't think Eli Apple is an elite player by any means, but I think he's better than what they had. And he gives them another young player to work with. Aaron Glenn, Dennis Allen are experts at that safety. At that secondary.
Going for 20 minutes now, and this is the first time we've mentioned a Saints cornerback. Previous, 6 games with Ken Crawley, he would have been mentioned within the first 5 minutes because he was struggling so bad. So I think that just goes to show you that Eli Apple is certainly an upgrade based on what Ken Crawley had produced so far this season. I think that was definitely a game where anyone defensively was going to get exposed because the Rams' offense is so potent and Sean McVay schemes them up so well to get guys wide open. And a lot of those times where guys were open, it wasn't because of Eli Apple or P.J. Williams or Marshawn Lattimore. It was just because, I mean, it was a well-run, well-executed play by the Rams, and the Saints played a lot of cover two, which leaves, openings, but they just really didn't want to get beat deep, which they had been, earlier this season. And certainly I think Apple, the longer he, spends in New Orleans with the coaching staff, with the defense, he should continue to improve.
I thought P.J. Williams had a good game. He got beat a few times. You're going to get beat when you play the Los Angeles Rams, but Williams made some very key plays in the clutch. Of course, he was the guy that made the breakup on the fourth down play that really was the biggest defensive play of the game for the Saints because the Rams were only down 3 at that time. They were driving. They were about midfield. If they can get a field goal or a touchdown, they can take the lead, of course. He makes the big fourth down breakup, and it was just a really good play. I mean, pass was right there. Receiver had his hands on the ball. He breaks it up. And that's really, we haven't seen enough of that this year from the Saints secondary. Passes defensed. I thought P.J. Williams had a couple of them in this game that were big.
He had 2 on the last drive. I mean, I think you could argue that P.J. had 3 of the biggest 5 defensive plays in the game. Obviously, Alex Anzalone's interception in the second quarter, totally shifted the game. At that point, these teams were just going blow for blow, but then, that set up another touchdown, and all of a sudden, the Saints were in control. Obviously, the Rams stormed back with a 21-0 run, but, at the end of the game, so the second to last drive, the Saints were only up 3, and then PJ made a great open field tackle on Cooper Kupp that forced a punt, and then on the final drive, he broke up passes on back-to-back plays, which really ended the game.
Yeah, P.J. Williams will tackle you. He will tackle you. He's a very good open field tackler. He's good against the run. He will come in and run support. That's his strength.
He has to because he's not that fast.
Right.
That's something me and some other reporters were talking about out of practice. That as the Saints were preparing for this game, we always, I'm sure you do too. We always try to figure out, what matchups the Saints are going to try to set up for themselves, whether it's offense or defense. Sometimes we can see a little bit at practice, but Sean Payton would obviously never give that away. But with PJ, we sort of knew he wasn't going to cover Brandon Cooks. Like, it had to be Lattimore or Apple on Cooks every time, just because PJ, I think, at the combine ran like a 4.59 or something ridiculous like that. But where he, lacks speed, he certainly makes up for in run support and typically with awareness.
Yeah, and I would say this. Every game in the NFL is called differently according to the officiating crew that's there. Yesterday was a P.J. Williams game. They let him play on the perimeter. They only called, I think the Saints had, 2 penalties in the whole game? Can you look that up?
Yeah, I can look that up.
The box over there. I think they had 2 penalties on the Saints and 4 on the Rams. They really let him play. And when they have a game like that, P.J. Williams is handsy because, like Josh said, he's not very fast. He can't come out of his cuts. He's grabbing a lot. He gets called for that a lot. But in a game where they're letting him play, he's not going to get called. He's going to play better.
And I think the coaches, sort of tell the guys to do that. I mean, we've seen that with Crawley, a lot. We've seen that with the other defensive backs over the past few years because you sort of just have to, when you're defending these receivers, I mean, this is obviously the best, passing generation we've ever seen, whether it's the quarterbacks or the receivers. So these defensive backs have to use whatever they can to help themselves. And typically, a lot of these things in the past might have been penalties, but if the refs aren't going to call it, then, you should use your hands and do whatever you can to stop these guys before the ball even gets there.
Well, one thing I want to touch on before we move on to some college action. The Saints offensive line, you and I were talking about it in the press box. It's really an overlooked factor. I mean, it's not among us, but I think nationally, it's one of the main reasons why they're so good. I think they have arguably the best offensive line in the league. And clearly in that game yesterday, we saw a number of times where the Saints defensive line, they might not have been getting to Goff, but they were disrupting the pocket. They had a number of times disrupted those jet sweeps they were trying to do with the backs. That wasn't working at all against the Saints, and mainly because the defensive linemen were getting penetration. Rankins did on one, Hendrickson on another, blew those plays up. We didn't see much of that except from Aaron Donald against the Saints offensive line. He's the best defensive lineman in the league. But I think the Saints offensive line is the main reason why this offense has been, other than Drew Brees' brilliance, why they are so good on the ground and through the air.
Yeah, it's so strange to think that, a few years ago, I remember everyone talked about the Cowboys' offensive line. And part of it was because, they had a few first-round picks, and then they added Lyle Collins. And then, obviously Ezekiel Elliott was in the midst of a incredible rookie season. I think that might be the one reason maybe people aren't talking about it for the Saints is that their rushing numbers are not incredible. I mean, it's not like Alvin Kamara is closing in on 1,000 rushing yards or anything because, he does so many different things, and his yards are pretty evenly split between rushing versus receiving. Mark Ingram hasn't had a great year, but I think the offensive line, in terms of the rushing game, has done exactly what they need to do. In some of these games, it just takes a few big runs to set up so much in the passing game. I think we saw against the Ravens, Sean Payton actually said, you have to consider 3.5 yards per carry a victory sometimes. And that's what they did against the Ravens. I think, yesterday they ran the ball pretty well, but ultimately they knew that passing was going to be the way to beat them, especially because they loved their matchup of Michael Thomas against Marcus Peters. I thought that was crazy. I've never heard Sean Payton ever admit something like that about an opposing player. He said that they liked their matchup of Thomas against Peters a lot. Those were his words, a lot. And I've never really seen him call that out, but obviously they were right because that was the biggest difference in the game. But back to the offensive line, the Saints have invested a lot in this offensive line. Teron Armstead's one of the highest paid left tackles in the league. Andrus Peat was a first-round pick. Max Unger, they give up Jimmy Graham for. Obviously got a first-round back too. But Larry Warford, one of the highest paid guards in the league. Ryan Ramczyk's a first-round pick. So, I mean, it's odd to me that people don't recognize what's going on with this offensive line as much. And maybe it's because people just pay attention to the stars, Drew Brees, Alvin Kamara, Michael Thomas. I think part of it, too, is that we live in the fantasy football age where offensive linemen don't generate stats, so nobody ever knows who they are. But I think you ask people about the team last year and this year, most guys are going to give the offensive line a lot of credit for why this team is having success.
Well, here's just a little stats to back up what we're talking about, just so you know we're not making it all up. When the Baltimore Ravens played the Saints the week before, they had 11 sacks in the game before. They get against the Saints, they get 1 sack on Drew Brees. Now, Minnesota had 0 sacks. They have 2 of the best defensive ends in the league, Danielle Hunter from LSU and Everson Griffin. Of course, that was his first game back.
But they had 10 sacks against the Lions.
They had 10 sacks, what I was getting at. They had 10 sacks yesterday. They had 0 against the Saints. And then yesterday, Brees was not sacked at all by Aaron Donald, by that group, and Ndamukong Suh. So 1 sack they've allowed the last 3 weeks combined to Baltimore, Minnesota, and the Rams. Those are 3 of the better defenses in the league, or at least better defensive lines in the league for sure. That's remarkable. Then the other stat that I think is very important that gets overlooked, the Saints are now 9 for 10 on 4th down. And most of those are 4th and shorts situations that Sean Payton is going for it. And he's got such confidence in that line, and rightfully so. They're 9 for 10 and getting it, but those are huge plays. You and I talk about it a lot. They extend the drive. The defense has got to stay on the field. They're getting worn down. You give Drew Brees more opportunities to get the ball to Mike Thomas and Alvin Kamara, guys like that. Most other teams would elect a punt or, would not go for it there, but Sean Payton has such confidence because of the line he's going for it.
And part of that is the Taysom Hill factor. I imagine you know every Taysom Hill stat off the top of your head because Jeff is a little obsessed with Taysom. For those of you that don't know.
What's not to be obsessed by? Best player in the NFL.
Ever, but in the history of the NFL, right?
He is the modern-day Jim Thorpe, as I pointed out.
But no, I think part of it is that, when they have Taysom on the field, it gives these defenses so much to worry about. I mean, because most defenses, they're worried about stopping Alvin Kamara and Michael Thomas. Those are their top 2 priorities. But when Taysom Hill gets the ball, he can beat you running, he can beat you throwing. So, it's just impossible to stop. And the Saints have exploited that. But they were also really good on 4th down last year. And that brings me to my point, and I talked about this the last time I was here. Sean Payton is having a incredible season. I mean, he has been masterful dialing up this offense. They have, I think the last 4 games they've scored on the opening drive. And it's just, it's incredibly impressive the way that he is not only integrated Taysom Hill into the offense, they've quickly got Traquan Smith up to speed with Tent Ginn out. And then I think he deserves a lot of credit for what the offensive line is doing. I mean, most of it should go to Dan Roshar, who is probably one of the best offensive line coaches in the league. But I think Sean Payton, they figured out ways to sort of misdirect Aaron Donald yesterday. There were a couple of plays where Donald was just completely out of the play, and I don't know if it was because of the footwork of the offensive lineman that he thought they were going another way, or if it was just that Andrus Peat or Larry Warford put a good block on him. But it would seem like whichever way Donald was coming, the offense, would move the play another direction just so that they couldn't let him disrupt the game, which is something that he frequently does.
No doubt about it. All right, we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the Michael Thomas cell phone celebration. I think we have to talk about that before we move on to the LSU game. And Rod, I'm going to get your question. Just give me a second. We'll talk a little more about the celebration, quote unquote, of Michael Thomas. It was a huge story yesterday. It was something I recognized immediately because I'm old and I covered the original cell phone celebration by Joe Horn back in 2003, of course, against the New York Giants. He has 4 touchdowns and hides a cell phone under the south goalpost and under the padding. Michael Lewis, the beer man, retrieved it, and that was one of the more that was back when the league was doing a lot more of that. There were Ocho Cinco was, I think, and Terrell Owens had they had the Sharpies out. They were doing this stuff. We haven't seen anything like this in a while because players are getting fined or they're getting penalized for it. But so I liked it because it was refreshing. I know a lot of people are criticizing. I've had a lot of friends today reach out, talk about how dumb it was. It could have cost the Saints. I'm usually on that side for most part, but I thought in this one, they were up by 10. I felt like they were not going to lose the game for 15 yards. The players in the locker room loved it, so I was on board with it.
People need to chill out. This is still a sport. I mean, they're just out there having fun. And Michael Thomas made that point afterwards. It's he knew that he would be getting a penalty, but he wanted to have fun. And you saw everyone, in that Saints locker room absolutely loved it. Mark Ingram had the quote of the day. Let me just find it really quick. He said, when your man does something like that, legendary like that, the kickoff team got to go cover because that was legendary. And I mean,
I thought the legendary was a little over the top.
Okay, fine, but
legend.
But he's right. But he's right. Like when you make a 72-yard touchdown catch, when you put the game effectively out of reach. I mean, it wasn't totally out of reach because the Rams are so good. But yeah, you know what? Guys that are on special teams, go cover that kick. Like, you know what? Big whoop. And
they did.
Will Lutz, well, no, they did a poor job. Will Lutz kicked it to the 5, but then the Rams ended up getting to about the 40.
Made a great return.
So, I mean, I think, that it did hurt the Saints a little bit, but, who cares?
In
like,
the end,
it's going to happen. It's going to happen one time this year. It happened in the biggest game. And I agree with you that, players – I like that the celebrations are coming back. I think you need to watch some of the Seahawks celebration.
That was great.
They had a choreographed dance number the other day against the Chargers. But I think, the NFL banned props. So that's why we're not seeing, the cell phone thing. We're not seeing guys grab popcorn. I think the ref threw the flag as soon as Michael Thomas touched the goalpost. And I'm curious if he knew that he was pulling out a cell phone or if he just – it didn't matter what he was doing under there, that it was automatically a penalty for touching the goalpost. But either way, I mean, Michael Thomas is going to do that one time in his career. No other Saints player is going to do that this season. And I think in that spot, when you're winning the biggest game of the year, I think it was a great move.
Well, here's the other thing I really liked about it, and this is, a little esoteric, I guess, I don't know, but I like that he acknowledged a player from a previous era. I like that he he's new school. He's the young, hot receiver for the Saints. And this is a hat tip to someone from a previous era, albeit 15 years earlier. But you don't see a lot of that anymore, frankly. I like the fact that he was honoring a former player, a great former player. I've had people talk about it. People act like Joe Horn was like this caricature because he was a crazy, outgoing guy. He was a 6-time Pro Bowler. He was the leading receiver in the history of the franchise, for a long time. He's a great player. and was a very popular player. And when I talked to him yesterday, he was really honored about it because he didn't expect it. Mike Thomas did not talk to him about it beforehand. He just did it, and he was really, I think, a little overwhelmed at the reaction. He said he had, scores. I think he said 100 text messages and phone calls. That could be exaggerated, knowing Joe, but he did seem to be quite touched. And I've had a lot of people reach out today saying, "Oh, we need to bring Joe Horn back and let him start the Who Dat Chat." That's not a bad idea. Have him get a chance to meet Mike Thomas. He told me he bought his jersey. He's a huge fan of his. He thinks he's the best receiver in the NFL. I think it would be cool to bring Joe Horn back and let him and Mike Thomas get together. I mean, arguably two of the probably three greatest receivers in the history of the franchise.
I actually think that's a great. I think they should do that. First, if they get a home playoff game,
Yeah.
I mean, you save that for
That's
a
when I would do it,
situation
too.
like that. I think that's a great idea. And I imagine that Joe Horn and Michael Thomas probably talked at some point today. But to your point, Michael Thomas loves New Orleans history. I mean, it's wild when you watch his Instagram or his Twitter. He's always talking about No Limit Records or Cash Money Records, all these old New Orleans rappers, whether it's Master P or Lil Wayne, all these guys. He's constantly just putting photos of these guys on his Instagram, paying homage to these guys, and that's something Teron Armstead pointed out. So the fact that he did that for someone like Joe Horn. I mean, Michael Thomas just recognizes greatness. He knows what's going to rally the Saints fan base. I think that's why he has fit in so well
smart.
here so quickly. And I think you're absolutely right. I thought it was a great moment. I actually had lunch with a friend today who said he hated it because it wasn't original. And it's you don't always have to be original if you're paying homage to someone. I mean, there are plenty of movie remakes that are better than the original. That doesn't mean they shouldn't have made it because it's not creative.
That's not true. We'll get into that another time.
There are
very
plenty.
few are
I'm
better.
I'm not saying it's the majority, but there are.
A Star Is Born is not better than the original.
All right.
Christopherson.
Okay. I mean, you're just
not
old,
going to
so you've seen all.
You know why
these
they've never
old-school
made a
movies,
remake of
but-
Godfather? Because they'll never make one better than Godfather.
Okay. Well, okay. What do you think? Do you think Michael Thomas's version was better than Joe Horn's?
No, I thought they were both great.
Okay.
They were both great.
There we go.
That
That's
was
fair.
good. But I understand your point, and I do agree that it was a nice way of paying homage to a former great and a very popular player. I thought it was a great decision. I loved it. And I also think, I think it's a little strategic on Mike Thomas's part. He, just by virtue of his name, it's a very common name, and I think he has never risen up above, say, Julio Jones, Odell Beckham Jr., much more flamboyant Odell Beckham Jr. I think it's his way also of getting a little attention, frankly.
Absolutely. And it's so crazy. I mean, I don't know if we want to get into the tweet, at Reggie Bush or anything, but, Michael Thomas is pretty insensitive he's pretty sensitive about people and where they rank him. He pays attention to all these things. If anyone puts him in their top 5 or top 3 or say he's the best receiver in the league, he's always retweeting it. If they're not putting him up there, he's always saying something about it, showing that he is emotional like that. And he wanted this opportunity on the big stage to show that he belongs in the top of that conversation. And I have actually heard people make that point too, that Michael Thomas is such a generic name that people are never going to, consider him the best. But at the same time,
that's silly. Michael Jordan's a popular name, pretty common name.
They're very similar, two first names.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. If you're great, you'll get recognized, and he's starting to get recognized. And that was his greatest moment.
His greatest game statistically, and his most recognizable moment of his career in the biggest game of his career of a regular season, I should say. But real quick, I do want to point out Therese Paylor from Yahoo, I think, put it perfectly. He said it was 93% fun, 7% foolish, and I think that's absolutely right. And unfortunately, the 7% people that thought it was foolish are the ones being a little more vocal today.
Yeah, I mean,
go away.
Lighten up, Francis.
Yeah, go read a book.
All right, let's move on back to the LSU game because Rod, one of our loyal followers here, one of our regulars at the Balcony Sports Lounge, and I tell you what, I'm going to be dominating some wings here in a little while. If you haven't been out to the Balcony Sports Lounge, Chef Keith Beckton does a great job. The chicken wings here are phenomenal. All the food here is excellent. The fish, always fresh, right out of the Gulf Coast here. Oysters, the char-grilled oysters in particular, among my favorites. And you can come upstairs, and Avery will take care of you, serve you some drinks. He even brought a bunch of candy for us in the spirit of Halloween, which I have partaken a little too much already, dominating some Baby Ruths. But Rod has a question. He wants to know, although the playoffs are a long shot now, is LSU looking for a New Year's Six impossible opponent? That's a good question, Rod. I think if LSU wins out, and I think they will, they play Arkansas this week. Arkansas is not going to, even if LSU has a letdown, I can't see Arkansas beating LSU. The tricky game is going to be at Texas A&M. I still think LSU wins that game. But if they win out, I think they're going to the Sugar Bowl. Because right now, they only drop. The best thing about that defeat for LSU was they only dropped to number 9. I think everybody recognized Alabama was so dominant. So they're only dropping to 9, I think, gives them an outside shot now of leapfrogging Georgia, assuming that Georgia is going to lose in the SEC championship game to Alabama. Don't we all assume that? And Georgia right now is number 5. So if Georgia loses to Alabama and LSU wins out, I think LSU, the way the Sugar Bowl works, they have to take the top-ranked team that's left that's not outside the college football playoff. That would be, in my opinion, probably LSU, unless Georgia gets in the SEC championship game and it's like a field goal game at the buzzer. Maybe the voters don't drop Georgia down that far and they get to go to the Sugar Bowl. But it's going to be Georgia or LSU in the Sugar Bowl. I think Sugar Bowl officials will tell you they'd rather have Georgia because Georgia travels. I mean, LSU plays in that game. Everybody just comes in, goes to the game. They might stay one night, but for the most part, they're going back home. SEC officials would rather have Georgia for the money, but right now, to be honest with you, most of the money comes from the TV contract anyway. Who would really like Georgia are the hotel and hospitality industry of New Orleans because they're going to get a lot more money in the city. But I do think LSU's got a great shot at getting in the Sugar Bowl. At one time, it looked like it might be against Texas, which would have been an intriguing matchup. Texas's star has kind of fallen. So I don't know who it would be against. Probably a Big 12 opponent. Still could be Texas. They're 6-3. West Virginia. I could see West Virginia being an opponent, or Oklahoma, depending on what happens the rest of the way of the college football playoffs. So I think that'll be interesting to see how that works out. Right now, it looks to me Alabama, Clemson, Notre Dame, they're kind of shoe-ins for the college football playoff, I think. Nobody in the ACC is going to challenge Clemson. Nobody's going to challenge Alabama. And Notre Dame, they only have one game I think they can trip up the rest of the way. That is at Southern Cal, who's also very, very much down. And they are looking at a coaching change at Southern Cal. So I think Notre Dame's going to be in the playoff.
I think so. I mean, they look great so far.
One spot left. Yeah. Maybe Michigan.
Well, I think you probably get one Big Ten team in there, but whichever team doesn't. Ohio State has not looked good. Michigan has looked really good, but I think whoever wins the game has a good shot of getting into the playoff, and then whichever team loses the game is probably not guaranteed one of the New Year's Day Bowls, just because, I mean, those teams have struggled, Ohio State specifically, but all the other Big Ten teams have not been impressive this year.
No,
but I do think
Wisconsin's really down.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to be good.
I do think LSU, though, really has to be impressive these next couple games because it's the weirdest thing with the voters that it's all recency bias. Like, there are going to be some voters that vote, between Georgia and LSU without remembering that LSU beat Georgia.
Right.
And so it's just going to come down to, like you said, I mean, if Georgia plays Alabama really tight, that's going to impress the voters. But I think if LSU goes out and dominates the next couple of games, then that would probably give them the inside track.
Yeah, and I think Ed Ogeron had it right. One thing I liked about Coach O after the game, he didn't make any excuses. He said, we got whipped. I mean, he lost 29-0. I think that was pretty apparent. But he basically said, look, we got to get bigger and stronger across both lines. I think that's apparent, but how do you do that? I mean, you got to go out and recruit All-Americans. And I think one thing that is a little unfair to Alabama, everybody, yes, they recruit well, but so does everybody else in the SEC. Alabama develops these guys. I mean, Quinnen Williams, the defensive tackle, had 10 tackles in that game. And you don't see a defensive tackle with 10 tackles. He had 2 sacks. He's going to be a top 10 pick in this draft. He was not a high-profile recruit. I think he was a 3 or 4 star, as they say, and he's developed into a top 10 pick.
When you see a defensive tackle get 10 tackles is when the quarterback runs right into him 6 times.
Okay, you're back on that song. I see. I was really impressed with the receiver for Alabama, Jerry Jeudy.
Yeah.
I've never seen a guy stop and start like that since Darren Sproles. Darren Sproles, running back for the Saints, a diminutive guy. He's 5'5". Jerry Judy's 6'1" and fast as lightning. I think he's going to be an incredible NFL receiver.
And that's two first names, but one of them is a lady's name. Maybe that'll get him a little more recognition than
Mike Thomas.
Michael Thomas.
Yeah, you might have to do the cell phone thing. They're so good right now. The quarterback, as dominant as he is, the running back Najee Harris, along with Damian Harris, both going to be first-round draft picks. Their receiving core is deep. Their offensive, I mean, we were watching their offensive line blocking in that game against LSU, and they sustained their blocks 10 yards downfield. I mean, they are still mauling their man. The receivers block that way. The tight end blocks that way. They're just so well coached. I just don't see them having any weakness right now unless Tua gets hurt. That's the only way I think they could lose. And I hate to bring that up, whenever I say a player getting hurt, but it's the only way I think Alabama loses. Even Clemson, who I think can match up with them athletically, and Clemson has three defensive linemen that are going to be first-round draft picks. They'll certainly match up in the trenches better than LSU did. They've got a freshman quarterback, and good luck with that, taking a freshman quarterback against Alabama. I don't see that being very successful. It would be remiss if we didn't talk about the Tulane Green Wave. I know not a lot of people here in our studio, in our live audience, are Tulane fans, but Tulane had a huge win. They had a huge win. They went on the road, beat South Florida, and they now are 4-5, and amazingly are back in the hunt for a bowl. The move to go to Justin McMillan at quarterback, the transfer from LSU, obviously was the right move. He sparked this team. I got to be honest, I never thought they could go on the road and beat South Florida was 7-1.
Really good.
And Charlie Strong's got that program going in the right direction. And they didn't just beat them. I mean, they dominated them. They blew them out. Now they come back home this week. They get East Carolina, a team that's in the bottom of the American Athletic Conference standings. They have a chance to get back to 500 at 5-5. And then they have a tough game at Houston. Then they come back home and play Navy. Navy's down this year. I think there's a legitimate shot that Willie Fritz is going to get Tulane's first bowl in a long time if they can just take care of business against East Carolina and Navy.
These guys want it so badly because of the way they just missed last year on that wild ending. But I would certainly think that winning it on the road against South Florida should get them amped up for the rest of the season. They don't play another team that's better than South Florida. So
they'll play Houston. Houston, who's having a good year.
Houston's not as good as South Florida, I don't think.
Probably not, but it looked to me like I watched the replay of that game. It looked like South Florida had no idea how to defend the ground attack of Tulane. They just did not know how to stop them. And I know that can be frustrating when you have very little time to prepare. That's one of the reasons it's so successful at schools like Navy, Paul Johnson at Georgia Tech. Willie Fritz, of course, has used that to their advantage at Tulane. They don't have the athletes a lot of times to match up with some of these programs. But Justin McMillan, he's just making the right decisions in that offense. And that's part of what that quarterback position is required to do. We see Taysom Hill, you and I laugh about in the press box. I mean, he's got to make the right read. It's a split-second read. A lot of players can't do it. And Justin McMillan, I didn't know he could do that as well as he's doing it for Tulane.
I wonder how things will be looking for LSU if Justin McMillan was still there.
I'm going to ask him about that tomorrow. I'm interviewing Justin McMillan tomorrow. I want to talk to him about LSU, the decision to transfer. Does he watch LSU now? Did he watch the game? I know he didn't watch it Saturday night, but what does he think about Joe Burrow?
And next year we could be having the same conversation about Lowell Narcisse, wherever he ends up.
Yes, because he'll probably be a highly rated recruit. LSU's quarterback situation clearly needs to be addressed long term. They've got a couple of prospects coming in, but if they're ever going to beat Alabama, the only way I think you can beat Alabama in their current dynastic state where they're just so good, so deep, I think you've got to have the athletes to match up with them across the board, which LSU has. Then you got to have an NFL quarterback. I think you see, like Clemson beat them with Deshaun Watson, had the athletes, and they still barely won the game. Georgia matched up They had a great quarterback in Jake Fromm and almost won the game. You've got to have a dynamic playmaker quarterback. You can't have a game manager. That's not going to work because you're not just going to line up and run it on them. You got to have somebody who can make plays.
Yeah, I hate admitting that you're right, of course, but that a good quarterback can elevate a team significantly. And you're right. I mean, they had Watson. I'm blanking on the other teams that have beaten, Alabama because so few have.
Kelly, I think Chad Kelly beat them with Ole Miss a few years ago, and then Texas A&M always gave him trouble when Manziel was there.
Yeah. So, I mean, when you have a quarterback that can stress the defense like that, and you just need a guy who's going to give Alabama's coaching staff nightmares when they're preparing. And LSU hasn't had that guy in a long time. And they need to find him. And you would think that there's got to be a great quarterback out there that wants to come play for LSU because, I mean, there's normally so much talent across the board that these guys should know that a good quarterback can elevate them right back into the national championship. And it just hasn't been the case. And maybe it's because of the lack of development. Maybe Sean Salisbury is going to be the difference maker. But
I think that's a start. I don't think Sean Salisbury alone is the answer, but I think upgrading the coaching staff is a start in the right direction. I can tell you, I've had people tell me when Shea Patterson was committed, he was the top quarterback prospect in the country out of Shreveport, was committed to LSU, and then decommitted. I've heard that in part it was because his brother was on the coaching staff at the time, and he was sending the practice scripts to Shea Patterson, LSU practice scripts, and it was just all running the ball. This was when Les Miles was there, unimaginative running the ball, and Shea Patterson finally decided, you know what, this isn't what I want to do. I'm going to Ole Miss. That was the Hugh Freeze fallout, of course, but that's why he didn't go there. You're not going to attract a top quarterback running a prehistoric offense the way Les Miles was. Ed Ogeron knows that, and they're going to try and, I think, upgrade that, or at least address it in the offseason. We'll see if they're able to do it. Okay, I think we've got about 5 minutes left here. I want to get a couple of thoughts from you real quick before we wrap up. On the Saints, they go up to Cincinnati this weekend. You and I will be making the road trip up there. It's going to be cold. I think it's like the low of 39 degrees. I'm not prepared for that at all. I know you have Minnesota roots. You're used to that.
That doesn't mean I like it.
I do not want any part of cold weather. Do you think there's any chance the Saints, they've had some emotional games here now, are spent and overlook the Bengals in this game and get tripped up in the cold weather at Paul Brown Stadium?
So I think there are probably some players that are spent, but I think Drew Brees is just on a mission this year. I mean, Drew Brees wants it so bad. He wants another Super Bowl. He wants the MVP that, I think the Saints have enough guys that could play a 40-game season and not tire out, that even if there's a handful of guys that are emotionally spent because they haven't been through a run like this, I think you got enough good leadership and enough talent that it really shouldn't be an issue. Obviously, this will be a tough game and certainly not one they can afford to overlook. And I think Sean Payton's going to be sending that message all week because, there are probably some people that are just worried about the Eagles, get a chance to knock off the Super Bowl champion who they thought they were going to play if Marcus Williams makes that tackle last year. But, I mean, Michael Thomas doesn't get emotionally spent. Alvin Kamara doesn't get emotionally spent. I just think those offensive linemen, they just wake up and, they're just – it doesn't matter.
It seems like human nature to have a letdown.
It should be, but I just think they have the right mix of guys. Honestly, I was on the drive here, I was actually thinking this team could go 15-1. So I'm going to pick them until they lose. I'll pick them against the Bengals. I do think the Bengals could give them some issues, but no A.J. Green. He suffered a significant injury. Joe Mixon's, I think, been banged up pretty much all year. So I just don't see that this is the team that could take advantage, even if some guys, aren't on their best
Look,
day.
If A.J. Green doesn't play, they've got no shot. Because the only shot they really have is to have the passing attack make some plays. Because the Saints, again, they stopped the run after about the first quarter in that game against the Rams. Todd Gurley came in leading the NFL in rushing, and I thought they did a commendable job in holding him under 100 yards.
Absolutely. I saw a stat today that they haven't allowed a 100-yard rusher in 17 games. So I think, last year there was some concern with the defense because they were giving up, I think, like 4.8 yards per carry. Like they were toward the bottom of the league in that statistic. But, I mean, they've really turned it around. I think Sheldon Rankins deserves a lot of credit. I think Demario Davis probably deserves the most credit for fixing this run game. And I also wanted to point out A.J. Green reportedly will miss 2 games with his injury. He doesn't need surgery, but 2 games.
Yeah, they're coming off a bye.
This Sunday. No, that came out today.
That's what I'm saying, though. So he even had time to rest up. And he's still out.
Yeah.
That's a huge break for the Saints. And, look, they're very good this year. I don't want to underplay how good they are. They've had a lot of things like that go their way. And that's what happens sometimes when you have a special season. A lot of things come down to when you play a team on the schedule. And the Saints this year, it seems like they're catching some breaks as far as injuries are concerned. The Saints are one of the healthier teams, I think, in the league. And they should be getting Marcus Davenport back in the next 3 or 4 weeks, I would imagine. That'll help their defensive line as well. The Saints in that Bengals game are 4.5-point favorites on the road. And that sounds about right to me. And I'm with you. Until the Saints show me otherwise, I'm not going to pick against them the rest of the year because they are beating some, as Sean Payton pointed out yesterday, they've beaten a lot of good teams.
They've beaten, 4 teams in a row that were, at the time, division leaders.
Yes. All right, well, let's wrap it up on our 14th episode of the Dat Chat podcast. I want to give a shout-out to Jim McPhail and his lovely wife, Catherine, who are always great hosts here at the Balcony Sports Lounge and Restaurant 200 North Beach. Shout out to Avery Woodcock behind the bar, mixing the drinks. He's going to give us a couple glasses of wine here after we get done here. And a big shout out, not only to Luke Augusta, our great engineer, who does a great job always here setting us up, making us sound great, but his son, Jason, celebrating his 21st birthday tonight. I think we're all going out. We're all going to dominate Bay St. Louis tonight and celebrate with Jason. But happy birthday to Jason. We're very, pleased that he elected to spend his 21st birthday with us. Who wouldn't want to do that? We're going to maybe do some shots with Jennifer once we get off the podcast here at the Balcony Sports Lounge. Bay St. Louis, I want to thank everybody for coming out and tune in again next Monday as we return from the Dat Chat podcast in Cincinnati, Ohio. Josh and I will be coming directly back here. I think Josh is going to make it. And we'll be back here as always, throwing the party at the Balcony Sports Lounge. Thanks for joining us. What do you got?